Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 10. So this chapter is all about tobacco, and we're going to talk about some of the history of tobacco, especially in the US, and how some different laws and things like that have changed and affected sort of the regulation of tobacco. We're also going to talk about, again, just some general pharmacology, how tobacco interacts with our bodies, and then also go over some both physiological things about tobacco and also some behavioral effects as well. So interesting chapter, again, talking about tobacco and how that kind of affects us as another form of a drug that may be more familiar to some people. All right, so for this chapter, we're going to cover first the different types of tobacco and kind of go through a little bit of the history of that. Then we'll talk about this idea of tobacco under attack, right? The idea of how public opinion and views and laws have changed over time towards this substance. Then we're going to go into some of the adverse effects of tobacco, the pharmacology of how it works, some physiological effects, as well as behavioral effects. And then, of course, we'll kind of talk about dependence and addiction and things like that. All right, so let's go ahead and start off by talking about some different types of tobacco. So you can see kind of in this image, there's obviously lots of different ways that tobacco is consumed and produced for different consumers, and that has changed a lot over time and over the course of history as well. So one category of tobacco we have is smokeless tobacco. So this is tobacco that is ingested in some other way than burning and smoking it. So some examples of this include snuff, which was actually a type of smokeless tobacco more popular back in like the 18th century, especially in England. Then we also have chewing tobacco, which is more common now. Again, a way of ingesting the tobacco orally or chewing on it to then have that nicotine dissolve and get through into your saliva. Of course, we also have smoked forms of tobacco as well. We're talking about things like cigars, cigarettes, and now even more recently, things like electronic cigarettes as well, which deploy the nicotine component with actually minimal, if any, tobacco oftentimes as well. All right, so with these different types, I'll just make a point here. So one of the things with the smoked tobacco types, we talked about smokeless, where snuff was early on, especially 18th century England, chewing tobacco more common today. And then for the smoked tobacco types, cigars were, again, more popular earlier on. They actually peaked in popularity around 1920 or so, though they are still, around today. They contain actually quite a bit more nicotine in them than cigarettes do. And just looking at the size of them, that sort of makes sense as well. In terms of cigarettes, obviously those have been around for quite a while, even as early as in the early 1500s, looking at some of those early uses in Spain, actually. Factories that produced them started appearing around like the 19th century. And it became more widespread use once those machine produced cigarettes became available again, more in that 19th century area. All right, so those are the different types of tobacco. Pretty straightforward stuff here. But let's talk now about sort of the views towards tobacco and how this has changed and adapted over time. So we're going to talk about this from the point of view of, again, tobacco under attack, or the idea of how public opinion has shifted more towards a negative view of tobacco. So this all started sort of back in 1604, where King James of England actually published an anti-tobacco pamphlet. So this is kind of where this started. And he stated that it was actually harmful to the brain and dangerous to the lungs. Though he did support the tobacco trade in America, again, he started sort of this idea that maybe it isn't the best thing and there might be some dangers associated with it. Around 1908, we saw New York City actually starting to make it illegal for women to use tobacco in public. So a couple of, factors going on here. But the quote here for this was, to protect women from themselves, they would outlaw their ability to smoke in public. So quite a few issues with that, but That's one of the early forms of regulation here in the US. Then in the 30s and 40s, we started to see some research come out linking cigarette smoking to actual cancer. And this caused tobacco companies to actually form more research councils and actually start doing more research on tobacco to kind of disprove this link towards cancer. And so this brings up a lot of things we can talk about here with research and how you can find what you want to find when doing research if you aren't being careful about how you do that research. So plenty of, drug, alcohol, tobacco companies today do research to kind of show what they want to show. And so it's always really careful to make sure when you're reading and understanding and digesting research that you're aware of who has paid for and sought out to do that research, because again, we can induce bias fairly easily when doing research. So it's careful to make sure we're aware of that when interpreting it. So obviously, again, with these links to cancer, tobacco companies didn't want their sales to go down, which this did cause to happen. As soon as this linking to cancer appeared, we saw decreased use of tobacco, specifically with the 1964 Surgeon General when he released that there was a link here between smoking and cancer use. And this is actually when we started to see the sharp decline in smoking in the US was after the Surgeon General's report came out in 1964. But again, tobacco companies didn't want their sales to decrease, so they're working sort of on the other side of the coin, trying to show that it's not harmful and get people to keep buying and using cigarettes. So again, maybe some matters of opinion, but really, companies are going to look out for their best interest here, even if it may not be what the science is truly showing. Then in 1965, we actually had, so just 1 year later, Congress actually passed a regulation that required warning labels to be put on cigarette packages. So this was something done again to help inform the consumers about the dangers and the risks associated with smoking. If they hadn't necessarily read the Surgeon General's warning, they now will see these warning labels and are mandated to have them. 1971, TV and radio advertisements were banned, so you weren't able to advertise cigarettes on TV or on the radio after 1971. 1990 was when they banned smoking on planes and buses. So this was, again, a more general, widespread approach now to reducing the use of public smoking in the US. And then we see around 1998 where the laws prohibiting the sale to minors were really starting to be enforced and carried out in the US again. So we can kind of see as this shift happens over time, we can see this progression. One of the things that always surprises me is how recently those sales to minors were really kind of ingrained into the rules and regulations. So again, long progression here of how we went from early, inclinations that maybe this wasn't the best thing for us, all the way to the modern 1900s and how the US has sort of adapted our opinions and our rules towards smoking and tobacco use. So what this all kind of led to was this quest for, quote, safer cigarettes, right? Because people still wanted to ingest the nicotine. They still wanted to, perform this act of smoking, and companies still wanted to sell them these products. And so the goal here became, how do we make this product safer for consumers while still allowing them to consume it and us to sell it to them? And so some of the research here looked at some different things on, does maybe the level of nicotine in the product make a difference, or maybe even the level of the tar component as well. And so when, these, quote, safer cigarettes came out, e-cigarettes, things like that, or just general cigarettes with lower nicotine or tar, we would see that people adjusted their behaviors to negate any of the benefits that were really present from these safer cigarettes. So for example, when lower levels of nicotine were, part of these cigarettes, people would just adjust their smoking patterns. So they would just smoke more to get those same levels of nicotine, even though each individual cigarette may have had less in it. They also tend to take more puffs or inhale more deeply, again, with those low nicotine cigarettes, because they're still trying to draw out and get more of that actual chemical nicotine. Again, the tar component here is like that sticky brown material that you often might see. And so the development of filtered cigarettes was sort of a way, again, to try and reduce the amount of tar being ingested into the body. Again, no real benefits came of this, though today we do still see that those filtered cigarettes are widely the most popular sold here in the US. Something close to 90% of cigarettes in the US are those filtered cigarette types. Again, of course, we have electronic cigarettes being a more recent development. And these are ones that, of course, use batteries or some other type of power to vaporize different nicotine liquids or chemicals. So these actually don't have much tobacco, again, if any, in them, but their main goal here is to administer the nicotine to the user here. And there have been a lot of rules and regulations more recently on these, especially with the sale to minors and things like that. And so this is definitely something that the US is still kind of trying to, get their regulations and their rules around, as well as tobacco companies. Interestingly enough, since most of these aren't sold by tobacco companies, even the big tobacco companies often are fighting against the use of electronic cigarettes because, again, they want people to continue to buy their product. With current use of cigarettes and nicotine in general, one of the biggest factors of use and, again, how much people use these really comes down to their education level. And this is a big thing that we see in correlational research and looking at who is more likely to be a smoker, again, in current modern times. And so what we see is that people who graduate from college, only about 12% of them tend to be, quote, smokers or, use electronic or regular cigarettes. However, those with only a high school education, we see about 31%. So again, 12% for graduates of college, 31% for only high school graduates. So we see a much higher percentage of those that don't have college educations being, quote, regular smokers. Similarly to this, looking at younger children, and specifically we have data on 8th graders, we can see that 8th graders who were planning to go to college, we only saw about 2% of them who were smokers of some kind. Even though it's crazy to think of 8th graders as smokers, some certainly do. Especially with e-cigarettes and things like that being a more prevalent thing with younger generations. However, 8th graders that didn't have a plan to go to college, we saw about 6.3% of them. So 2% for those that had a plan to go to college, 6.3% for those that didn't. So again, relatively almost 3 times as many that don't have a plan to go to college. So education level really here is a big factor. Again, this is correlational research, so we're not necessarily saying that it is what causes those changes in use, but there might be some factor linking these two things together. People with higher educations maybe are more aware of the risks or things like that. But that is the number one link we see between rates of use. All right, let's talk now about some adverse health effects specifically with smoking. So most of these are probably going to be things you've heard of before or that you are just aware of, but we can still talk through them and just kind of, break them down specifically. So of course we have some major diseases linked to smoking, right? Things like lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, or even chronic obstructive lung disease. So different diseases mostly related to the lungs and circulation here. Interestingly enough here, cigarette smoking is the number one avoidable cause of death. So it's something that we could choose not to do, but that many people still choose to do and suffer pretty severe consequences due to it. So one of the things here I have is warning labels listed here. So interestingly enough is that we talked about some of those regulations requiring companies to have warning labels on their products. And interestingly enough, there are a set number of them that companies are required to cycle between when placing them on their products. And so again, these are warning labels that are designed to warn people about these major disease risks for smoking. Things like causing lung cancer, heart disease, complicating pregnancy. There's some issues there we'll talk about as well. Another major concern or adverse effect of smoking is secondhand smoke, right? So you've probably heard of this before, but it's the idea of inhaling the smoke that comes off of the smoker, right? Whether that's what they expel or even the smoke that's indirectly coming off of the cigarette. And this is something that is a big concern, especially was a major turning point, I think, in the 90s, where people started to really pick up on this as a factor that needed to be addressed, especially with parents smoking around their children and things like that. So when we talk about secondhand smoke, there's two different really kinds of this. There's mainstream smoke, which is, again, the smoke that is inhaled by the user and then expelled as secondhand smoke. And then what's known as side stream smoke. And this is the smoke that basically comes off of the cigarette or rises from the ash. Both of these are more diluted than direct smoke, but they still contain, those same carcinogens and dangers to them. All right. And then, of course, we have just general worldwide deaths and worldwide issues related to smoking. So interestingly enough, the World Health Organization estimates that tobacco causes about 8 million deaths per year worldwide. So it's quite an extreme number when you think about it, again, for being an avoidable cause of death. So we really could choose not to engage in this practice, yet many people do, and many people do suffer some of those consequences. So we'll talk about why that is and some of the addictive properties as we go as well. Of course, smoking in pregnancy is a large risk as well. So smoking while pregnant increases risks of things like miscarriage, lower birth weight, or sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. The number one most studied and documented of these being low birth weight of infants when they're born, when their mother smoked while pregnant. We can also see that smoking while pregnant can lead to some longer lasting effects on both the intellectual and physical development of the children. So we might see some small but consistent differences in body size even throughout the lifespan. Of course, neurological problems, as well as problems with reading and even math, like math skills as well. And then we also have documented hyperactivity at various ages of those children as well. So quite a large risk here of things that can be associated with smoking while pregnant. All right, so lots of adverse effects with smoking specifically, but let's talk now a little bit about the pharmacology. What's actually going on here at sort of the neuronal level when we're talking about nicotine? So nicotine is the chemical or the drug that is specifically acting here when we're talking about smoking and tobacco. Nicotine is a complicated drug, especially when we talk about the pharmacology and the method of action of this. So let's first get into the absorption and metabolism before we get to that. So looking at absorption and metabolism, most of this is absorbed through inhalation, right? Most people are smoking forms of tobacco to ingest the nicotine. But with this, about 90% of what's inhaled actually gets absorbed, which is a relatively high amount for the actual chemical that is present. The toxicity level of nicotine is actually not crazy high. 60 milligrams of pure nicotine is enough to be a lethal dose in humans. And technically, one cigar actually contains twice that much nicotine in it. Of course, we're not actually ingesting and absorbing that much of the nicotine when smoking that cigar. So that's why we don't get these lethal doses. It's not delivered fast enough, and it's not delivered at a high enough dose to actually hit those lethal amounts. But it is interesting to think about when we think about the amounts of what is toxic and what is present in what we're actually handling and using. Now, the liver is actually responsible for reducing and eliminating the majority of nicotine. About 80 to 90% gets eliminated through the liver and then out through the kidneys as well. So now let's talk about the mechanism of action here. So again, this is a little bit complicated when we're talking about nicotine because it works in a couple different ways. So it mimics acetylcholine, which if you remember is a neurotransmitter, and it acts in a couple different ways. So nicotine acts both as a stimulant and a depressant. And it's a unique drug in that sense because it has both of these factors kind of associated with it. So first, what it does is it first stimulates those receptors. And this is just a general image of sort of this synaptic cleft here. You'll see dopamine's labeled, but it's actually really acetylcholine that we're looking at here. And so what happens first is it will stimulate those receptors like acetylcholine does, and then it blocks the receptors so more acetylcholine and other nicotine can't get in. It also causes the release of adrenaline and has some different types of sympathometric action. So what that basically means is that, again, it's working on multiple fronts. It's both stimulating and depressing the nervous system at this level. So again, it works by mimicking acetylcholine and specifically on what are known as cholinergic receptors. So again, acetylcholine. Again, one of the more unique drugs in this sense because it has sort of those multiple effects, both a stimulant and a depressant in this manner. It also works on a pretty short time window here where you get those stimulating effects pretty quickly, but for a short period of time on the matter of minutes, and then switches over to more of those relaxed, calming effects, after that. But that refreshes and gets out of the body pretty quickly in the sense that these effects do not last long, which is one of the other reasons this is so addictive, is because people are drawn to go back and smoke another cigarette or have another dose of nicotine in a short window because those effects are so short-lived that they desire them again and again in such short periods of time. In terms of the physiological effects here, we can talk about this from a couple different fronts. We can talk about when we think about nicotine in the sense of sort of its acute problems. We can see this in terms of tremors or convulsion, or even potentially some paralysis of muscles used in respiration. And this is a problem when we get high levels of nicotine at acute points or small, minute points of time. From a lower level, kind of like, temporary point of view, we'll sometimes see, just issues with nausea, dizziness, or general weakness. And oftentimes this is what newer smokers tend to experience. How it affects the central nervous system and the circulatory system also works in a lot of different ways. So it can increase your heart rate and blood pressure. It increases actually the amount of oxygen your heart needs, but it decreases the amount of oxygen your blood is able to carry around with it. And so you get this sort of shortness of breath effect, not necessarily just from the smoking, but from the actual effect of nicotine here as well. It also increases the electrical activity in the cortex. Again, one of those sort of stimulating properties that we see here as well. It also has an interesting effect sort of with hunger when we look at this. So some of the reasons why we actually see a decrease in hunger after smoking, what we think are maybe the inhibition of hunger contractions that are actually part of the stomach. So those physical muscle movements tend to be less, and so we get a decrease in hunger. We also see an increase in blood sugar level after smoking. So again, might be telling our brain we don't need to eat. And then the deadening of taste buds through the actual smoke itself is going to make just food less enjoyable to eat. So those are some of the physiological effects which kind of fall under the pharmacology here when we're talking about this. But we also have, I'm ahead of myself. These are some of the effects on the central nervous system that we just talked about, right? Increased heart rate, oxygen, need of the heart, but reduce oxygen carrying capability of the blood. Increase that electrical connectivity. And then we see the effects on hunger where it decreases hunger for these multitude of reasons. All right, now let's switch over and talk about some behavioral effects here. So number one, when talking about behavioral effects is reinforcement, right? We talked a little bit about this just a second ago. One of the reasons why nicotine is so addictive and reinforcing is because of these reinforcement behaviors. It acts on such a short time scale that people are drawn to repeat these actions of the reinforcement over and over and over again. And because it also has both a stimulating and calming effect, these are both positive in different ways to many people. And so you can get multitudes of reinforcement connections to this drug. When we talk about sort of nicotine specifically, again, we have some of these different stimulating and calming factors, but those can vary based on, number one, the expectation of the user. If they're used to sort of that stimulating effect, they'll have associations with that, and that's more what they're going to experience each time that they smoke. The environment matters a lot as well. So what environment you're used to sort of being in and using the drug in is going to reinforce your use of that drug. And then genetics, of course, here as well, might play an important role in this effect. When we talk about dependence or sort of that addictive property of nicotine, there's some general conclusions that have been made about this. Nicotine is addicting, right? So we know that this is the case, and we know this due to a lot of different things. Really, the process of why it's addicting and one of the reasons why we consume it is actually similar to many of those that we determine to be even more dangerous drugs, such as heroin and cocaine. It's this effect of the effect that it has on the body and the desire to repeat those behaviors. But one of the reasons nicotine is so addicting, again, like I said before, sometimes even more so than some of these more dangerous drugs, is because it works on such a short time frame. So because those effects are quick and immediate to your association with actually smoking, but also because the effects dissipate quickly, causing you to repeat that action over and over and over again, is part of the reason that we see such a strong addictive property to smoking specifically, and nicotine here. So when we talk about how to actually stop smoking, this is a really interesting kind of problem that we've tried to solve. And there's some interesting kind of outcomes that we see from it. So number one, obviously it's really challenging. So it's something that many people struggle to do. Many smokers have tried to quit or quit multiple times and simply come back to it and pick it back up. So it's a really challenging process to quit altogether for many people that do smoke. However, what's really interesting to me is that most of the people that have successfully quit smoking report that they did so without the use of any formal treatment program. So they just sort of decided to stop smoking one day and have continued to do so. So while we have a lot of these treatment programs that can be beneficial and helpful to some, the majority of people that are successful quitters of smoking tend to do so just on their own. Some of the things that we do have as challenges and helpful things for quitting smoking are things like replacement therapy, right? So replacing the induction of nicotine through other means, things like patches, nicotine patches, or even some pharmacological therapy like medications actually designed to help you wean off of smoking or cigarettes and that nicotine effect. There are, of course, behavioral challenges too. I talked about some of those and the reinforcement properties. In fact, actually, someone who smokes a pack of cigarettes a day is going to get about 50,000 reinforcing puffs of nicotine every year. So when we think about that, we think about trying to train your dog to do a trick and you have them sit down and you give them a treat. How many times does that really take? Maybe you do it 10, 20 times a day for maybe a couple days, and they start to pick that up. They've already learned that. They've already associated that. So in just a small handful of times, you can teach your dog to do a pretty simple trick. That reinforcement happens very quickly between the command sit and the action of sit. So when we think about this dependence, this addictive property of nicotine, we see so many, because of those short effects, that repeated exposure, reinforcing actions of ingesting that nicotine. So when we talk about quitting, how to stop smoking, the main thing, the main solution here that we really have is combining different therapies, right? Combining some maybe replacement therapy, pharmacological, and maybe even behavioral treatments as well, to reduce those actions and that associative link between smoking and the feeling of nicotine. And it's a hard problem. It is a very challenging thing that many, many people suffer with. All right, and that wraps up chapter 10. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Next week, we're going to jump into chapter 11, which is another familiar drug, actually, hopefully maybe more familiar to most of you, and that is caffeine. So that'll be really exciting. And we'll talk all about caffeine and how that, again, affects our body and our mind and things like that.